Hi, this is Remembering the Past, the show where we talk about people who've died recently who've had a profound effect on our history, our society, or our culture. We're not going to start with a person tonight, we're going to start with a thing. And by way of introduction of this, which happens to be our feature, there's this.
I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. They got a million toys at Toys R Us that I can play with. I don't want to grow up, I'm a Toys R Us kid. They got the best for so much less. You really flip and live from bikes to trains to video games. It's the biggest toy store there is. Gee whiz! I don't want to grow up, cause baby is my thing. I couldn't be a Toys R Us kid. More games, more toys. Oh boy, I want to be a Toys R Us kid.
Well, you're not going to have any more Toys R Us kids because you're not going to have any more Toys R Us. The once popular toy store chain is dying at the age of 70. The company was founded in 1948 by Charles Lazarus. Charles Lazarus, by the way, also died recently at the age of 94. He was no longer associated with the company, but I'm sure he's sad to see it go. They recently announced they would close their 800 North American stores, victim of a number of forces. Shifting tastes in children's toys. Children are going today more for video games than for toys. Competition from Amazon and Walmart, and the large debt load they could never recover from after venture capitalists bought them and took on a lot of debt in 2005. Here's Time Magazine on the death of Toys R Us.
Toys R Us will reportedly sell or close all of its U.S. stores, according to the Wall Street Journal. The paper reports the company let employees know on Wednesday that it's filing liquidation papers in advance of a court hearing on Thursday. The news comes 6 months after the big box chain filed for bankruptcy. The toy store has been weighed down by an enormous amount of debt and also has had to deal with competition from other major chains like Amazon, Target, and Walmart. The Washington Post reports the closings will affect as many as 33,000 jobs and would likely happen over time and not all at once. According to USA Today, it would be one of the biggest retail liquidations since the Sports Authority filed for bankruptcy in 2016.
In the 1980s, Toys R Us was an almost incredibly popular toy chain. It sort of lost its way in the 1990s, and as I said, that private equity deal didn't help it at all. Might want to point out that the CEO of Toys R Us at the end was a fellow by the name of Dave Brandon. He was an ex-Michigan football player. Went on to become the CEO of Domino's, but he's well known to Michigan fans, not so much for his playing days under Bo Schembechler, as in the early 2010s, he was the athletic director of Michigan, and let's just say it was a fairly stormy course. He was the one who brought Brady Hoke to the Michigan football team as coach, and he instituted a lot of his policies that weren't very popular with the fans during that time, and he was asked to leave. I mean, by the end of his tenure, they weren't even selling out their football games. Let me tell you, if you don't sell out the big house during Michigan football games, something is wrong. So he moved on to the CEO job at Toys R Us. He got an 8-figure bonus just last year while the company was declaring bankruptcy. There's American business for you. And he's got himself a nice multi-million-dollar penthouse in Midtown Manhattan. I checked the Michigan blogs to see what they had to say about the closing of Toys R Us under Dave Brandon. My favorite comment was this one. NASA really needs to look into Dave Brandon's ability to fail upwards. If we could harness that kind of energy, we'd have a Mars colony up and running by the end of the week. I'm going to give the last word on the Toys R Us closing to this erstwhile Toys R Us kid.
This is my favorite Toys R Us.
And why are you crying?
Because it's closing.
Well, as long as we're on distressed children, the natural segue is to T. Berry Brazelton, who died recently at the age of 99. Dr. Brazelton was a Harvard pediatrician, and he's generally regarded as the most influential expert on child development since Dr. Spock. He was a best-selling author, he had a television show, and he developed the Neonatal Behavioral Assessment Scale to gauge how infants were developing. I know my wife and I read his books in the 1980s before we took our kids to Toys R Us. Here's Dr. Brazelton talking a little bit about his career.
I always wanted to be a pediatrician. When I got out of the Navy in the 40s, I got to Mass General, and they said, "Oh, we'd like for you to be an internist." And I said, never. I want to take care of children. At the children's, I was trained in illnesses, but I never was trained in what children were like or what parents were like. And so I did about 5 years in child psychiatry, and then I went into practice in Cambridge and practiced there for about 50 years. I think the two most important things I've done, one was the television show that we did, which allowed parents to understand themselves see themselves on film. And we had 13 years of wonderful work. Parents still remember me for that. And the second was the touch points, which brought together all of the newborn assessment and the face-to-face work that we done. Touch points are always the time just before a baby takes a spurt in development. The baby falls apart and regresses. And the parents think, oh, what did I do wrong? And they fall apart and regress too. If you touch into the system, that's why I call it touch points, and give them back a feeling that regression is a precursor to progression, parents relax and they think of you as not only on their wavelength, but they are amazed that you see into the baby in a way that they see into the baby. I wrote a book about it called Touch Points, and that caught fire. And then Josh Sparrow helped me develop a book on 3 to 6 year olds, and that's caught fire. And so it led us to set up a Touch Points project, which has now got 140 sites around the country, in which we're training people to offer interventions to parents who need them, underprivileged, people with special needs children, and it's working like a charm. The newborn assessment was really probably the most important thing I ever did in my development, for the field anyway, and it started in 55. I've been working on it now for 50 years. I could see that from my own children that each child really shaped the environment around them. The goal for the neonatal assessment was to share it with parents so they understood what kind of person they were getting and could put all of their passion right where it belonged with that child. Because the question I've always gotten from a new parent is, how am I going to know what kind of person this is? And as soon as you play with a baby, you know. What I dream of is that every parent will have an opportunity to give her and his child the best future that they can dream of, and that every child will be ready to accept that and take off to get there. And I think we can do that.
I have to tell you, I really liked his books. And he was a good guy. He didn't have much of that Harvard shine about him. I think that was because he was from Texas. Here he talks a little bit more about his career, but more importantly, what he wants to see in the future.
During the course of my career, I've cared for more than 25,000 children, provided guidance and support to thousands of parents and caregivers across the country. And I've fought on Capitol Hill for parental leave and for special needs children under the age of 3. Once we drew attention to newborns' amazing competencies, people began to recognize that a lot more was going on inside babies' brains than had previously been thought. But this exciting brain development doesn't happen in a vacuum. We know that the health and development of a baby is directly influenced by the quality of care and experiences a child has with their parents and other caregivers. We know that as babies, the way we are held, talked to, and cared for each teaches us about who we are and how we're valued. This profoundly shapes who we will become. It's time we made babies and their families a priority and made the investments needed so that high-quality supports and services are available to the babies who need them. We need our government to step forward and make programs and services for babies a priority, so our youngest children can have a solid foundation and step into their first classrooms ready to learn, eager to learn, succeed in life, and take on the world.
We're going to make a brief mention of Tom Benson, who died recently at the age of 90. He was one of the most important owners in the NFL. He was the owner of the New Orleans Saints. He was a billionaire who made his fortune in car sales and through banking. very shrewd businessman, wasn't always admired for his shrewdness, bought the Saints in 1985. He also bought the New Orleans Pelicans of the NBA, who seemed to be having a resurgence. Even though he was a dyed-in-the-wool New Orleanian, he spent a lot of time in San Antonio, which is where a lot of his car dealerships started out, and he threatened to move the Saints to San Antonio after Hurricane Katrina, but after a lot of sturm and drang, that calmed down. After the Saints won the Super Bowl, and he gave a lot of money to Ochsner Clinic, Tulane, and Loyola University of New Orleans, he acquired a much better reputation in the city. Here's Jeff Duncan, sports writer for the New Orleans Times-Picayune, to talk about Tom Benson.
Tom Benson, obviously a New Orleanian, a self-made billionaire who built a huge business empire, not only here in New Orleans, but also in San Antonio. And then in purchasing the teams, back when he bought, of course, the New Orleans Saints in 1985, he kept the teams in New Orleans. I think that's going to be part of his legacy. Is not only did he keep the teams local, but he also raised the standard in the building. That will be his greatest legacy, because he changed the Saints from being a laughingstock to being a very competitive organization, and ultimately brought a Super Bowl to the city of New Orleans. There's no question he was a polarizing figure, but I think largely in the last decade, especially during the Sean Payton, Drew Brees era with the Saints, and the fact that Tom Benson stepped up and bought the Pelicans at a time when there was a lot of confusion and disarray in the management and ownership, I think he won over most New Orleanians, most Louisianans, because he was keeping these teams here, and he's also raised, I think, the standard at the Pelicans organization, trying to be competitive there. Changing the name to the Pelicans, I think, was part of his legacy as well. But certainly people will always remember his passion play with the city of San Antonio. It's going to be part of his legacy. But I think largely in the last decade or so, Tom Benson has become much more popular as an owner, and will always be remembered, I think, in a favorable light by most New Orleanians. There's no question he's been a great civic leader during his time, and especially later in his life, became very passionate about giving back to the community, and certainly the community has benefited from having Tom Benson as an owner, and over the years as just a civic leader in our city.
Well, I'm going to close on that note. I want to thank my producer and IT genius, Sid Tepps, and we're going to close tonight with Barbara Ann Alston, who died recently at the age of 74. She was the lead singer for the Crystals, and that was one of the girl groups that Phil Spector used to create the Wall of Sound in the early 1960s. Now, when I say she was the lead singer with the Crystals, that takes some explanation. She was only the lead singer for the Crystals for a little while because she was shy, but this is her voice you hear on one of the Crystals' big hits, Uptown.
He's a little man, but then he comes uptown, he came into my tenement. Uptown where folks don't have to pay much rent, and when he's there with me, he can see that he's everything. Then he's tall, he's outdoor, he's a king.
Phil Spector, again with the castanets. Well, the Crystals had some trouble after that classic. One girl got pregnant. As I said, Barbara didn't like singing the leads. She sang the leads on their follow-up, and their follow-up is one of the most interesting songs in rock and roll history. Before I close with it, I'll just say it tanked, and you'll see why in a minute. Phil Spector turned his attention to other groups, including Darlene Love and the Blossoms. His biggest hit for the Crystals, and in fact their best song, was He's a Rebel, but the problem was it wasn't sung by the Crystals, it was sung by Darlene Love and the Blossoms. Phil Spector would do that. He'd release the song under one group's name when another group sang it, probably to avoid paying both of them. I think Darlene Love got some royalties later on, which she deserved. Anyway, I'm going to close with this song that was written by Carole King and Jerry Goffin, and it's supposedly about little Eva, their babysitter, the girl who did Locomotion, and how she was beaten by her boyfriend. Carole King has disowned the song, but you've got Jerry Goffin, who was a little off when it came to women. We've done his podcast, and you've got Phil Spector, who was, well, a little off when it came to women. And they came up with this 1962 song that you don't hear much anymore, and in fact, you didn't hear it much at the time because a lot of radio stations refused to play it. But it's part of rock history, and it's part of the story of Barbara Ann Alston, Carole King, Jerry Goffin, and Phil Spector. This is He Hit Me, and It Felt Like a Kiss.
He hit me, and it felt like a kiss. He hit me, but it didn't hurt me. And when I told him